Empress Charlotte's exquisite beauty made jaws drop, but no one realised that her elegant face had a twisted mind. She slowly went insane, even stealing the Pope's goblet and using it to drink from fountains in Vatican City. Commoners watched on in horror, but Charlotte's fall from grace had only just begun. Few things from the annals of history are more bizarre or more tragic than the sordid tale of Empress Charlotte of Mexico. Sent over from colonial Belgium to rule alongside her husband, Charlotte, or Carlota in Mexico, quickly experienced a violent and infamous breakdown. Born Princess Charlotte of Belgium on June 7, 1840, her father was Leopold I and her mother was the French Princess Louise of Orleans. Her mother died from tuberculosis when Charlotte was only 10 years old. With the princess gone, and with Charlotte being her only daughter, none of the men left in the Belgian royal family felt up to the job of raising a little girl. Thus, the grieving girl had to move in with a female family friend. This isolation would end up having very, very grave consequences, but the backlash was also immediate. After her mother's passing, the change in Charlotte's temperament was sudden and disturbing. Where she was once carefree, she became over-serious and introverted. Right before her 16th birthday, Charlotte met Archduke Maximilian of Austria, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph. Even though Maximilian didn't have much chance at ever sitting on a throne, Charlotte fell for him anyway. But if she thought it was going to be a fairy tale, she was quickly proven wrong. Charlotte was desperately and undoubtedly in love with Maximilian, but his dating history was full of red flags. Before meeting Charlotte, the Archduke had already been engaged before to Princess Maria Amelia of Brazil. Maximilian didn't walk away from his fiancée, far from it. At the tender age of 21, before their wedding could take place, she died from tuberculosis. Many believe that Maria Amelia was the real love of Maximilian's life, and that he never got over her. In July 1857, just weeks after Charlotte turned 17, she finally got what she wanted and married Maximilian in a lavish ceremony in Brussels. Soon after, she moved to the Austrian court in Vienna and buddied up with her new mother-in-law, Sophie of Bavaria. As it happened, Sophie adored Charlotte, naming her as the epitome of grace and class, but not everyone at court took to her the same way. Maximilian's sister-in-law was the imposing and beloved Empress Elizabeth of Austria, who was considered one of the most beautiful women in the empire. As such, the new bride spent much of her time looking over her shoulder at Elizabeth. By 1859, 2 years after their wedding, many nobles thought Charlotte should have been pregnant by now, but no child was in sight. During this time, Maximilian pulled even further away from Charlotte. At one point, the couple went on a trip to Madeira, which just so happened to be where Maximilian's first love was buried. Charlotte's husband was barely spending any time at all with her before his pilgrimage to his lover's grave, and afterward, he practically abandoned her. While she stayed in Europe, Maximilian made a trip overseas to Brazil to visit Maria Amelia's old kingdom. By 1863, Maximilian was back in Europe with Charlotte, and they were both itching for something to actually do. Then, an opportunity fell into their laps. At the time, Emperor Napoleon III was trying to expand the French territories into Mexico, and he wanted Maximilian to become a puppet emperor, with Charlotte as his puppet empress. As dyed-in-the-wool imperialists, Maximilian and Charlotte should have been overjoyed at the invitation. Instead, they had reason to be terrified. After all, everybody knew the Second Mexican Empire was far from stable. France had only just invaded, barely had a foothold within their borders, and were on dangerous legal ground with their plans. As such, the whole Austrian royal family desperately tried to get them to decline. Charlotte, however, was to blame for what happened next. Certain that becoming a Mexican empress was God's divine will for her at last, it was Charlotte who convinced Maximilian to accept the post in the end. It would be their doom. Charlotte and Maximilian landed in Veracruz, Mexico on May 29, 1864. The moment they arrived, they faced a harsh reality. The town was a notorious bastion for a free Republic of Mexico, and the liberalist townspeople met their new emperor and empress with a very icy welcome wagon. Although the new emperor and empress of Mexico had the French army on their side, military might simply wasn't going to cut it with the angry people of the nation. Instead, the royal couple went for PR tactics, with Charlotte changing her name to Empress Charlotta in a very cringy bid to blend in. At this point, Maximilian and Charlotte still didn't have children. In fact, they didn't seem to be able to have children, which meant they weren't likely to have an heir. Maximilian was particularly upset about this, and he came up with a disturbing solution. He decided to adopt two Mexican heirs, Agustin and Salvador, who were both grandsons of a previous emperor of Mexico. Maximilian saw Agustin and Salvador as the answer to many of his current problems, so he was able to completely ignore the fact that their biological mother was still alive and very much present in their lives. For what it's worth, Charlotte was completely against the idea and tried to convince her husband to give it up. In response, he forced her into a cruel act. When the time came to pick the boys up, Maximilian did the absolutely heartless thing and made Charlotte personally go to rip them from their mother's arms. Almost the entire time the couple was raising Agustin and Salvador, Maximilian continued to make a huge show of naming them as his successors. He gave the boys the titles of Prince, and even went so far as to make Agustin the next in line to their stolen throne. In reality, Charlotte's husband never intended to crown either boy, especially because he saw both children as not noble enough to carry on their line. Instead, Maximilian wanted his brother, Archduke Karl, to send him one of his full-blooded Austrian sons to be heir, and was only using the boys as a bargaining chip for this ultimate goal. Unsurprisingly, the Mexican people knew something like this was going on, and were deeply unhappy with Maximilian's adoption of the boys. That unrest was about to hit seismic proportions. Faced with this backlash, Napoleon III made a fateful decision. Mexico was a whole lot more trouble than he had ever wanted, and eventually the French emperor decided to cut his losses and completely abandon the idea. Suddenly, Charlotte and Maximilian were alone in a hostile country. This was bad enough, but then Charlotte made it worse. After hearing that Napoleon was abandoning them in Mexico, Charlotte performed the first of many desperate acts. Incredibly, she sailed all the way back to Europe with her two boys, intending to meet Napoleon in France and beg him to reconsider. After hearing the Empress was in town, Napoleon sent her a telegram saying he was ill and told her to stay away. Charlotte booked a room at the lavish Grand Hotel in Paris and settled in for the long term, forcing Napoleon to pull out a new defence. Instead of going to the hotel himself, he sent his wife Eugenie to talk to the Empress woman to woman. The idea was to convince Charlotte to give up and accept her and her husband's fate. Done with being kind and submissive, Charlotte demanded to speak to Napoleon in person. After she finally got her hard-won meetings with Napoleon, she arrived to find him completely unsympathetic to her cause. He refused to entertain the idea of supporting her as Empress of Mexico or giving her husband any leeway. Charlotte simply couldn't accept the truth, that she and Maximilian had lost Mexico, had lost many of their rights to nobility, had lost everything. Instead, a change began to take place in the Empress. She slowly became unhinged, and began making long, rambling and unheeded speeches to Napoleon. Charlotte went back to Miramari Castle in Trieste to regroup and look for new sources of support, but she didn't even make it there before her insanity worsened. On the way, she spotted a farmer in a field and, sure he was an assassin, screamed at her coachman to drive faster all the way home. She did, however, think she had one final ace in the hole. In a last-ditch effort to save her station, Charlotte planned to go all the way to the top, Pope Pius IX in Rome. She didn't even make it there before her rapidly deteriorating sanity struck again. While travelling to the Vatican, she informed her companion, straight-faced, that someone spying for Napoleon III was trying to poison her. Unfortunately for her, the Pope took the same hard line as Napoleon had. Totally bereft, Charlotte didn't leave her hotel room for 2 days and refused to eat. After all, she was terrified that spies were still after her. Still in Rome, Charlotte awoke 2 days later with an unhinged plan. Eyes red from crying, she dressed herself in black mourning clothes and stomped up to the Vatican again, begging for shelter from her imaginary enemies. She claimed if the Pope wouldn't let her in, she'd sleep on the stone floor outside. The Pope was understandably worried about the optics of letting a princess camp outside his door like a vagrant. He relented and set up a bed for her in his library. As a result, in addition to her other dubious claims to fame, Charlotte remains one of the only women in history to ever sleep overnight at the Vatican. Finally safe and surrounded by the house of God, Charlotte spent her evening in the library, still unravelling. She stayed up all night writing scores of farewell letters to her loved ones, and even scrawled out her will. To the Empress, this was the end times, and in many ways for her it was. Charlotte was never the same. Soon, her family had to make a gut-wrenching decision. Inevitably, news got out that the Empress of Mexico was deteriorating before the Pope's own eyes. Before long, her panicked in-laws tracked her down and sent her to recover as best she could at her beloved Castle Miramari. While Charlotte had been slowly losing her mind in Europe, she didn't realise that her husband's fate was getting darker by the day. Although Maximilian had tried to hold down the fort in her absence, he failed miserably. More than miserably, in fact. Eventually, Republican Mexican forces captured him, and after enduring months of his inept rule, they did not play nice. During his time as Emperor of Mexico, Charlotte's husband had made a lifelong enemy of the rebels. So when it came time for the court-martial, they easily found him guilty, then sentenced him to execution, ignoring the cries from across Europe to simply exile him and spare his life. From that point on, the grim fate of Charlotte's husband was sealed. On June 19th, 1867, just over 3 years after Maximilian took on the job of Emperor of Mexico, the guards brought the monarch to the Cerro de las Campañas at the crack of dawn. Maximilian knew he had no more options left except to bravely face down the barrel of a gun. After her beloved husband's violent death, Charlotte's doctors made a chilling decision. They didn't tell her about it. They believed that her fragile mental health simply couldn't withstand the tragedy, so she never knew that she was officially no longer an empress. At Miramari, Charlotte was in the care of her Austrian in-laws, but her blood relatives in Belgium had been desperate to get her back for weeks. In July of 1867, her brother's wife, Queen Marie Henriette, arrived at the castle to finally take custody of the former Empress of Mexico. But when Charlotte emerged, she couldn't believe her eyes. Charlotte had been under the care of her doctors and the Austrian armed guard for nearly a year, but this was the day that Queen Marie Henriette discovered the men had been horribly mistreating her. They had acted as if she was their prisoner for 9 months, and Charlotte's mental and physical state had taken another enormous nosedive in the meantime. While Charlotte's minders simply avoided telling her about her dead husband, Marie Henriette now actively pretended he was alive. In order to get her back to Brussels without doling out the ugly truth, she sent Charlotte a fake telegram from Maximilian, telling her she should go back to live with her brother, now King Leopold II of Belgium. Charlotte dutifully followed, but the damage was done. For the long years that followed, Charlotte lived a kind of death in life. She actually described herself in letters as dead, and although she likely never found out about Maximilian's fate, she did obsessively keep all of his surviving possessions, making a kind of shrine for him. During this time, she saw almost no one except her two sisters-in-law, Marie Henriette and the Countess of Flanders. As time passed, Charlotte only seemed to get worse. When the younger generation of her family would visit their ageing aunt, they were struck by her rambling, vague soliloquies. On particularly bad days, she would speak in a host of languages to imaginary listeners, but she could also turn terrifying in the blink of an eye. As lucidity started to elude her permanently, Charlotte would often have violent outbursts and tantrums during her confused states. At these times, she would throw around her plates and tear up the books in her library. She even once tried to get her hounds to attack an unsatisfactory maid. Then, when these fits passed, she would calmly take back up whatever she was doing. Even in her later years, people still respected Charlotte for what she represented, if not for the tragic shell of herself that she had become. When fighting erupted during World War I near her home at Bochout Castle, the German forces deliberately avoided entering the property because she was the widowed sister of the Austrian emperor. There's a persistent rumour that although Charlotte had no children with Maximilian, she did have a secret love child with a Belgian officer. Apparently she gave birth to a boy, Maxime, in 1867. Interestingly, the boy's parentage was always mysterious, and he also suspiciously refused to ever confirm or deny the rumours about his royal inheritance. Nobles of the time loved intermarrying each other to strengthen their family lines, and Charlotte's lineage was no different. She was first cousins not only to Queen Victoria, but also to Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. Some of the maddest monarchs in history were the result of inbreeding, so maybe this had something to do with Charlotte's eventual fate. Her terrifying and infamous mental breakdown has long puzzled historians. Though many attribute it to the emotional stress she was under, some experts have a more sinister explanation. According to them, her madness didn't come on suddenly. Instead, it was carefully orchestrated and started long before she went back to Europe. According to this theory, the rebels of Mexico so hated Charlotte and Maximilian that they began poisoning her slowly over a period of months. Historian Joan Haslip claims that one of the royal doctors kept slipping bromide into her coffee. Meanwhile, other rumours from the time claim incognito enemies put psychotropic substances in her food, causing her breakdown. Remember when Charlotte camped out at the Vatican? Well, before she left the Pope's residence the next day, she performed one final bizarre act. She actually took a goblet from the Pope's apartments. She then wandered around Rome with the cup, using it to capture water from fountains so she could drink without fear of spies poisoning her. In 1927, the end came for Charlotte at last. At 86 years old, she contracted pneumonia and influenza and died in her sleep. There are several accounts of her last words, but perhaps most chillingly, one attendant claimed her very last word was Mexico. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.